Good afternoon and welcome everyone again. Welcome to our webinar on why e-sourcing events sometimes fail and why that happens. We will be explaining that to you today. Again, as said, before we start, I would like to inform you that the participants' audio will be muted during the session, that the Q&A section is open for questions, which we can address at the end of this session, and that this session will be recorded. Quick introductions. My name is Noel. I'm a consultant at Brainbox Consulting, and together with my colleagues James and Bridget, we are going to talk you through our webinar today. Shortly about our company, we are a Brainbox. We are a Netherlands-based consultancy, and in Brainbox, focused on the digital transformation of procurement processes with the use of our procurement expertise and SAP Ariba. Last month, we introduced Brainbox's Sourcing as a Service, which is our fully managed service for your strategic sourcing activities. And in this month's webinar, we would like to present some examples and challenges of how sourcing events can fail and why that happens. So in light of our Sourcing as a Service, we want to give some more in-depth information on the specific topics. And for this, I would like to give the word to James.
Yeah, thank you, Noel. Welcome, everybody. And yeah, so what we're going to cover on today's webinar are a few different reasons why e-sourcing events historically may have failed or not brought the successes that you are expecting for your business, and try and pull some of those apart and give you some tips and pointers towards how to do this a little bit more strategically and efficiently and better planned going forward, as well as some of the advantages that we as a service provider may be able to offer you as part of that package. So we're going to have a look at why not aligning with your stakeholders prior to the event may be an issue. A big one is not having a clear specification or scope of work. It's often not the tool that's the problem, it's what you're putting into the tool. If you put garbage in, then you'll probably get garbage out. Not preparing adequately for the event. And again, that kind of goes back to things like specification and understanding what stakeholders want. Not being clear what the real objective is. So, what do you want to get from the tender and in what order? Everybody wants to make cost savings, but what else is important? Is it maybe lead time, or is it having more than one supplier? So not going down a single source route, for example. Avoiding backdoor selling is a big challenge with e-tenders, especially if suppliers have strong contacts into other people in the organization. Not including the must-have terms and conditions as part of the event. So what you definitely don't want to do is have contract discussions after you've awarded the business, because then the supplier has too much control over you. Not being able to consider or weight some of the non-price factors. And then ultimately, the complexity of some of these tools is also an issue. These tools are not often easy to use, and if you're using them for the first time, then especially if you're in a rush to get this set up and you don't have the resources to learn how to use it properly, that can be a factor, as well as not doing due diligence on the ultimate winner of the tender. If you've invited a supplier that you don't know much about and they end up putting in the best overall bid, then how do you manage that? Are you prepared to award them the business, or is it just a benchmarking exercise? So with that said, let's tackle the first one, and that is not aligning with stakeholders prior to the event. So often when e-sourcing events, or any sourcing event really, are thought up and are put together, one of the questions that doesn't really get given enough thought is that how serious are you about moving your business away from the incumbent vendor? In an ideal world, we all know that, in most cases, companies want to stick with their existing vendor unless they have a problem with them. So before you launch an RFP, whether that's an online or an offline quotation process, consider what are the costs to the business, or what are the inconveniences to the business to move away from the existing supplier? How long will it take you to do it? If you have to do things like material validation on direct materials, for example, and who ultimately is the decision maker? Is it procurement, or is it supply chain, or is it manufacturing, or is it R&D? It's rarely procurement on their own who can decide this. So, how are you going to align that decision with stakeholders? How are you going to decide whether to move away from the incumbent? Will you agree to move away if you get, for example, at least 5% savings? Or will you agree to move away if you can manage your risk better, or if you can cut your lead time? So all of these things go into determining what will be, or what will make the tender successful. So other than price, what else do you need to consider? What other factors do alternative vendors bring to the table, and align with your stakeholders what those factors are? And also, if there are any conflicting interests, if procurement is measured mainly on price, but manufacturing is measured on equipment efficiency or on-time delivery to customers, then clearly there could be a clash there that you're going to need to be able to balance and come up with some sort of weighted scorecard before you go to tender. Because if you don't do that work up front, then you're going to have an internal bun fight after the event, figuring out, well, who actually won it? Because if you're not weighting your suppliers on all of these different factors, then procurement, pretty unsurprisingly, is probably going to be looking more at price, whereas other internal stakeholders will have other factors that are important to them. So you really, really need to align with the other affected parties within the business before you build and construct your online e-sourcing event. Or even if you're doing an Excel and email based tender as well, I mean, the same logic applies. It just means it's less effort to sort of build that event if you're doing it offline, but the same logic will also apply to offline events. So the next one is something that I use the Spice Girls to help describe this perfectly. So what I'm really getting at here is you need to tell suppliers what you really, really want. And that's why I call it the Spice Girls analogy. Because if your specification or if your scope of work is not clear, or if it's incomplete or ambiguous, then if you're giving that to somebody to make a quote against, then two things are going to happen. They're going to quote something that is not fit for the purpose that you want to use, or they're going to increase the price and factor in that risk because you have not been clear in telling your suppliers what it is exactly that you want. So if you give them garbage, then they're going to quote you garbage, or even worse, they're going to quote you expensive garbage because they're not going to really understand what you're asking for. So they're going to factor in some contingency in their price to manage that risk on their behalf. So a clear specification or scope of work is absolutely vital. And if stakeholders can't give you that, then meet with suppliers, work with your stakeholders to get to a point where you have an accurate specification before you put something into an e-tendering platform. Because if you don't do that, then the results that you are going to get are going to be comparing apples with oranges, and you're not going to get the most from running an e-tender. So kind of similar to specification is all about inadequate preparation for the event. So part of this is understanding how are you going to set up your event within the platform, and how are you going to react if certain things play out during the event setup or during the time that the event is open and running for suppliers to go in and submit their bids. So some of the things that you should be considering here are how many rounds do you want to do? Do you want to do a first round to get an overall view of the marketplace and then narrow it down to 3 or 4 suppliers that come in really strong, that have the capacity and that can meet the specification, and then maybe doing a second round of the e-tender or the e-sourcing event with them? How are you going to incorporate negotiation into your overall event? So are you going to view getting the prices back and the offers back from the e-sourcing event as a first step, and then do an offline negotiation after that? Or are you automatically going to award the business to the winner of the tender, subject to them being able to meet your contractual requirements and capacity and all of the other non-price factors that you want to include as part of your tender? Have you done your due diligence on the supply base? Do you know what their lead times are, their capacity? Do they have reference customers that are similar to the business that you're in? Especially if you're going to more exotic markets to do your sourcing, do you really know who you're going to? Of all of the suppliers that you're inviting to the event, which ones are serious contenders versus which ones are there really just to make up the numbers for benchmarking, because we all do that. You've got to be able to know with your stakeholders, okay, guys, which ones are we seriously going to consider awarding business to? If it's only the incumbent, then I would question doing an e-sourcing event at all, because really then you're just using the other suppliers as a benchmarking exercise. And I would then question, is that really ethical? What if your incumbent supplier refuses to participate? It's happened to me on one occasion. So what do you do then? What's your plan B? You've got to have the answers to these questions. So as if these unexpected events or circumstances do happen, then you've got a plan B and you know how to work with it. How are you going to structure your supplier meetings prior to running the event to make sure that they have all been treated fairly? Because obviously the incumbent or any supplier that has a relationship with your internal stakeholders could theoretically have an advantage over those suppliers who you haven't had much contact with in the past, and that you're bringing into the tender really as a first touch point with them to understand more about what they can do and where do they sit in the market, both commercially and technically, compared to the vendors that are well known to you. So all of this needs to go into your preparation and planning, because if you don't do that, then it's going to come and bite you on the backside later on, further down the line, further downstream in the process. And part of that is really understanding what the real objective is. So, there are going to be a number of factors or a number of variables that you want to get from your event. But unless you sit with your stakeholders before you build your e-sourcing event to understand which objective is number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, until you know what they are in that specific order, then you're approaching this in quite a chaotic way, because we all know that it's not just price. But then if it's not just price, then what are the other things that are important? Okay, so maybe it's payment terms, maybe it's lead times, maybe it's capacity within the supplier's production plant to meet your requirements. So in which order are you ranking all of these? Because if you don't know, then how can you set up an event and rank suppliers based on what they're bidding on if you don't know yourself what you want and what your stakeholders want? You've got to do this before the event. You've got to do it before the event is built, because if you don't and you just upload part numbers and specifications, then theoretically, you're going to have to answer the question to the supplier that submits the lowest price bid, why are you not giving him the business? Whereas if you set it up as a weighted tender, considering the factors that you've ranked to be number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, and you've set up your tender in the e-sourcing event to reflect that, then it's pretty much a no-brainer then who you take forward to the negotiation phase, excuse me, or to the award phase, because you've done that work up front. So all of these things that we've been discussing here for the last 15 or so minutes, it's all about preparation. And just exactly the same as you have to be well prepared and do a lot of work in advance for any strategic commercial negotiations that you're having, it's exactly the same for setting up a sourcing event, especially an e-sourcing event where you're using an electronic platform to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So make sure that you know what your objectives are and in which order those objectives sit before you build and launch the tender and start communicating with your supply base. So backdoor selling is a bit of a pain point for all of us procurement professionals, because we know that no matter how hard we try, it's going to be difficult to completely eliminate this. So backdoor selling is if a salesperson from the supplier, instead of talking to you as the procurement professional or as the sourcing manager, they're going to your stakeholders. You know, maybe they're going to a plant manager or to a marketing director or to an IT director, whatever it is that you're buying. If the supplier's salespeople are trying to initiate conversations and get confidential information through the back door, we've got to try and prevent that. And e-sourcing is a great way to do this, because if you channel all of your communication through the SAP Ariba platform, or whichever tool that any of you out there are using, it makes communication centralized. It makes it go through one portal, through one email address, through one contact. And as long as your stakeholders have been informed and notified and told not to communicate directly with suppliers, and that all supplier communication must go through the e-sourcing tool platform, that's a really powerful way to avoid backdoor selling. Will it ever eliminate it completely? Probably not, but it will vastly reduce the potential that suppliers will go sort of around you and try and navigate a way to your stakeholders to try and get them to slip them confidential information that procurement would not usually share with them. So this one is both a potential benefit and a potential curse, depending on which way you look at it. So incorporating must-have terms into the event, on the one hand, is vital, because if you make the beauty about using e-sourcing is that you can set up events so that suppliers cannot submit prices unless they have ticked a box to say that they have signed your non-disclosure agreement and that they've agreed to your general terms and conditions, for example. So I would always recommend putting those items before they get to see the contents of the sourcing event. But then on the other hand, if you make them sign your standard contract as a precondition of getting access to the event, it may put some suppliers off, because usually in 99% of cases, you're going to get suppliers that will push back on some of your contract terms. And that's completely normal, because contracts, let's face it, are usually written highly in the favor of us as the buyer. And usually our suppliers, especially if they have a good legal department or a good lawyer that they work with, will usually push back on some of those terms. And that's completely normal, and it's to be expected. But getting them to agree to general terms and conditions that would be an absolute prerequisite of doing business with you, that should be something that you should be aligning with before the event. And then if you're having discussions around things like penalties and liabilities and warranties and compensation and lead times and on-time delivery and all that type of thing, that's usually something that would be negotiated in finer detail towards the end of the sourcing process. And it's really good that in e-sourcing events, you can build that in. So if you want to, for example, have a commercial discussion with your shortlisted suppliers between round 1 of a sourcing event and round 2 of a sourcing event, you can put your key performance indicators and service level agreement that you want to have as a buyer-supplier relationship in between those 2 events. So if, for example, you invite 10 suppliers to round 1, and then you think, okay, 4 of these suppliers look really, really strong. These are the 4 that I want to take forward to round 2. You could then have a detailed contract negotiation between those 2 rounds. And then if there's maybe 1 of those 4 suppliers that you can't agree contract terms with, or they are not willing to sign up for some of the things that you must have in your service level agreement, then you can maybe sort of put them to one side and say, sorry, we can't do business with you, and then take forward the other 3 suppliers into round 2, safe in the knowledge that you know that after that event, when you come to award the business, you're not going to be spending weeks and weeks and weeks fighting with them over legal or contractual terms, because you've already done that work up front as part of the event. And what's more, you've done that work when you know that you have some leverage over the vendor. So you've done it up front where you're in the driving seat. Whereas if you're trying to do it after the event, you're obviously then doing it on the back foot. So that is a huge reason why sourcing events can often, or e-sourcing events especially, can often fail, because you do all of this work and you get bids and you get suppliers that you think they've got really good prices. And then if only then you start to talk about contracts, then you've shot yourself in the foot, because you've lost a lot of the leverage that you have with that vendor. We touched on this one a little bit earlier. So failure to consider non-price factors. So we spoke a little bit about this when we were talking about aligning with stakeholders prior to the event. But really, just to say again, we can build your event because of our knowledge of the Ariba platform, and because we know what it can do, and we know that non-price factors are often just as important as the price. We can build your event so that the bids come out carrying a weighted analysis based on all of your important sourcing criteria. So a classic one is that you maybe want to give the incumbent supplier a bit of an advantage. So if it's going to cost you maybe 2% of your annual spend in engineering costs or validation costs, in terms of internal resources, or reduction in production efficiency to validate a second supplier, then you should factor that into the bidding. You know, if staying with your incumbent has a commercial advantage because it doesn't mean doing testing and reducing your production efficiency during that time, you need to factor that into the total price calculation. Likewise, if you've got suppliers that are offering you longer payment terms, then that obviously, days payable outstanding, DPO, is a measurable cash benefit to any business. And especially if you're talking with financial controllers or CFOs, they want to benefit the amount of cash that a business has at any given time. So if you're comparing the same price, but one supplier is asking for 14 days payment terms and the other one is giving you 60, then clearly the supplier with longer payment terms should be given preferential weighting. Likewise with lead time. Longer lead times usually mean that you're having to hold more inventory in-house, especially for production materials. So there is a cash benefit to a business for working with a supplier that is more flexible in their lead times and is able to get material to you on a quicker cycle. Because then if you're carrying 8 weeks of inventory rather than carrying 4 weeks of inventory because of their production lead time or because they have a longer supply chain, that is a real cash benefit. It's not just a nice to have. There is some actual cash advantage that you can put behind that in terms of what you could reduce your inventory by for shorter lead times. And likewise with capacity as well. If a supplier is not able to offer you the capacity to meet your demands 100%, or they're not able to react quickly enough if you have ups and downs in your production planning, this is especially a big one in the automotive industry. Automotive OEMs typically don't know what they want and their planning is pretty chaotic. If you need to have 2 or 3 suppliers to be able to meet that level of flexibility, then that again is a cost to your business, because you're having to pay for tooling or you're having to pay for validation costs to have more than one source. And yes, it may be in your overall long-term benefit to have several validated suppliers. I personally am a fan of having dual source or triple source. I think single sourcing or sole sourcing is dangerous in many cases, but there is a cost to the business to do that. So all of that should be weighted and considered in any e-sourcing event. And outsourcing an event to somebody like us, we can help and walk you through that to make sure that that completely 100% reflects the cost to your business. And then, excuse me, and then the complexity of the tool itself. So one of the things here that you need to consider, there are many e-sourcing tools out there on the market. Some of them are easier to use than others. But what usually happens is if you go out and buy for your own use a very easy to use e-sourcing tool that has a great user interface, what it usually means is that they're sacrificing some features to make that tool easier to use. Not always, but in 90% of the cases, I would say that's true. So instead of just going with a cheap solution that's easy to use, why not just consider outsourcing the whole process to somebody like Brainbox who could do it on your behalf? And likewise, we can also advise you ahead of the event, so as you're not wasting time and effort and money. Is your event, is that commodity or category, or is it suited to running an e-sourcing event? Because some of them are and some of them are not. And we can really consult with you ahead of that to be able to give you that feedback. We spoke a little bit about this on the last slide, but understanding what the platform can do, its capabilities, and then using the example of weighted analysis, making sure that you set up that platform and the event in the right manner to get the most from it. Because the complexity of the tool means that somebody who's maybe running 1 or 2 events, or has maybe used SAP Ariba 2 or 3 years ago in a previous job, they're never going to be able to set up the event and manage it as well as someone that does this like Noel every day. So, I mean, Noel, maybe if you could jump in and just give an example of things that are quite complex to set up in an e-sourcing tool, especially in Ariba, and how your knowledge of the back end of the platform, because you're our back end guru in terms of knowing Ariba inside out. Maybe walk us through a couple of examples of how that can add value.
Yeah, of course. I think plain and simple. Well, not so much simple, that's kind of the case, isn't it? But the good example is, while building a sourcing event, is the understanding of what you're going to build and how you're going to build it. An example of this is setting up lots or line items. Now, as a quick reminder, we always want to make a difference between lots and line items. Line items can be seen as the smallest entities in an event where a participant can place bids on, whereas lots can be used as a container for these line items, or even can be used independently. But an important attribute of this lot is that the bids made on these lots count to the extended price of every single line item that is within this lot. So there's already a difference there in building your event. So let's assume the situation where you put all your line items into a lot, like the container, as I said it. There are some important considerations to be made. Before starting and building it, it's important that it, is carefully understood and decided, since it will change the way of bidding during event by participants. In the scenario where we use lots, right? As I said, grouping of items can be made. For instance, how will the goods and services be awarded? Will it be by geography? Will it by volume? Or what are the goals of the sourcing project? Is it to maintain your incumbent suppliers, or is it to obtain cost savings? But while building these events, right, for the lots, it's also important to view this from the point of the supplier, right? Think about things like how can we reduce the complexity of those events, or what kind of item groups are attractive? Is it the more common line items you want to present or together, or items that are more tailored to the supplier capabilities, or even what some supplier constraints are in terms of design criteria, specifications, or even logistics. So these considerations must be made so a lotting structure can be created with care, right? Keeping in mind that it must encourage the competitive pricing and better participation. So I think, yeah, in conclusion, this example already shows the importance of the right understanding of a setup in order to make a sourcing event more successful.
Yeah, thank you, Noel. That's great. Really good insights for someone that knows the platform inside out. I mean, I've used it in the past, but I'm by no means an expert. I mean, my expertise comes really from the practical application and knowing what a buyer or what a procurement manager would need to consider. So, does your organization have the bandwidth to do all of this in-house? In a lot of cases, I guess they probably won't, because everyone is stretched at the moment and trying to do more with less resource. And a big one here is when you set up an e-sourcing event, dealing with all of the technical problems that suppliers may face, because they're not experts on the tool either. And often they will also have some teething problems with getting to grips with the technology and using the platform. So if they're contacting you, that's a lot of work, especially if then you have to go to your e-sourcing provider's technical support. If we do that, we'll take care of all of the supplier communication for you. So you don't have to worry about dealing with all of the to and fro and communication with suppliers, because we would look after all of that for you once you told us which suppliers you wanted to invite to the event. So yeah, lots and line items. The last one here we already covered. So yeah, I think we're done with this one. And then finally, the lack of due diligence on the ultimate winner of the tender. So a classic thing that happens is if you've invited, let's say, 15 suppliers to bid on your e-sourcing event, of those suppliers, you probably know 5 or 6 of them well. You'll probably know another 4 or 5 of them a little bit. And then the others will be the ones that make up the numbers that you want to really just test out to understand who they are and whether they're attractive to you or not. So what happens if one of those wins the bid? What do you do then? Is it better maybe to ask for fewer suppliers, but the ones that are better qualified and that you know can meet what you want them to do? Or maybe, for example, it's better to have more than one round. So you're using maybe the first round to understand who's out there and what their pricing is. And then in the second round or even the third round, you're narrowing it down to a very narrow scope of suppliers who can meet your terms and conditions and contractual requirements and capacity and lead time and so on and so forth. So helping you to design and architect that event and making sure that you know enough about the suppliers who could potentially win the bid. And if you don't, then maybe doing it as a two-round strategy is something that we can definitely help you with, because I've seen it before. Suppliers have won bids that we didn't want to source business to, and then you're sort of on the back foot then to think, oh, well, what do I do now? So the takeaway here is that we can help you overcome all of these potential banana skins. Because we're an outsourced service provider, we can walk you through this every step of the way, and we can give you as much or as little support as you want. So if you want to manage, for example, looking at which suppliers should participate, and then just give us those suppliers and the objectives of your tender, we can then build it and run it for you, and then hand it back when we've got all of the bids in for you to then negotiate with the suppliers. Or we can do a complete end-to-end process, advising you on the strategy that will work best for your objectives, giving you awareness of any potential blind spots up front beforehand, and sort of holding your hand with the preparation, making sure that you're not being tripped up or delayed because of technical issues that you're experiencing, or perhaps mistakes that you would have made trying to do it yourself. We can do all of that for you. As we said, we can also manage all of the supplier communication and onboarding, which is a huge amount of workload for anyone that's trying to manage that, as well as doing their day job and put out fires, which are part of everyone's procurement day-to-day tasks, right? So we will also eliminate any backdoor selling. We will make sure that as a third-party independent provider, that both stakeholders and suppliers would come through us, so we can manage all of that communication from one central marketplace, as well as anything like pre-event Q&As and roundtables. We can hold those on your behalf and make sure that's done in a completely neutral manner, so as suppliers can't accuse you of favoritism or being preferential to the incumbent. So by using an external provider, in a nutshell, we will not only take away a lot of workload for you, but we will also come across as being completely fair, neutral, and impartial, both to stakeholders on the one hand and to suppliers on the other, because we don't have any interests at heart other than getting you the best deal based on the criteria that you've given to us as part of the preparation for the event. So that brings us pretty much to the end, apart from the Q&A session, which we're going to do just now. But if you would like to have a demo or learn more about what this can do, then get in touch with Bridget, who is also on the call and is going to be moderating the Q&A in a few seconds' time, either by email or by phone. We speak English and Dutch, or if you want to speak German, reach out to me. I can speak German, and we would love to help you and help you understand a little bit more about what we can do and how it may be useful to your organization. So with that, Bridget, over to you to see if any questions have come in.
Yes, so we have one question so far, which came in, and it asks, can we have a download of this webinar? The answer is yes, of course. We have this webinar recorded. We will later share it across YouTube and our social media channels for a replay, for which you can also share with your organizations.
But I'm just thinking, if we got that question in, Musbahu, if you can just send your email address to Bridget at sales@brainbox.consulting. If you just ping Bridget an email with your contact details, we will make sure that we send you the URL to the recording so as you've got it then.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, James, for that addition.
Okay, so if that's the only question, and I think we're just about out of time as well. So thank you very much to everyone that's attended. Noel, Bridget, thank you for your input as well. And like I say, any questions or if anything comes up after this or you want to have a demo, just reach out to us. Thank you for joining us today, and we will see you on our December webinar, hopefully, where we will be interviewing a practitioner from a major international corporation to get their thoughts on running e-tenders in-house.
Thank you, everyone.